they hadn't got that plan on their report.
No.
And he said that it should have been identified in the report, which was on the monthly dental patches.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a worse application.
Right, we're actually live now, and we have a minute before the meeting actually starts. All right. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so we can start the meeting, please. Item 1 is apology. Yeah.
It's not quite 2 yet,
Pardon?
It's not 2 yet.
It's a few minutes early. It's 3
Oh, it
minutes.
says
Yeah, we're just a few
2 o'clock.
minutes.
All right, I'll
Just
wait
wait
then.
3-4
Apologies,
minutes.
it says 2 o'clock on the screen.
Chair,
Yes?
that's right.
No, I was looking at the screen.
Oh. One above it.
No, sorry, I'll use my iPad for time. You've got 3 minutes to go.
Actually, anyway, I'm used to being at the back. What? The agenda. Actually, temporary. Divided, 20 seconds.
Please remember, we're live, gentlemen.
Divided the 20 seconds.
Julian Dean.
It's just outside on night here.
Okay, it's 2 o'clock now, so we will start the meeting. Good afternoon, welcome to this meeting of the Place Overview Committee. I'm obliged to inform you that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to view the meeting using the link on the agenda. Item 1 is apologies for absence. We have apologies for Councillor Paul Gill, who is being substituted by Councillor Nick Bardsley. And we have apologies from Councillor Butler, Portfolio Holder, Resources. Thank you, Steve. You're a member of this committee, aren't you? Just double checking. Thank you. Item 2, disclosable pecuniary interest. Does anyone have any? No one? Okay, thank you. In that case, we will move on to item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. So we're going to consider the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of August. Does anybody want to pick anything up from those minutes? Is everybody happy with them? Yes? Could somebody propose them and someone second them? Okay, Dan Morris has proposed. Can I have a seconder, please? Do we have a seconder? Paul Wynne. Thank you. We have minutes from the meeting on the 17th of September, which will now be considered at the next meeting of the committee. Public question time. We've got one question received from Mr. Stephen Malloy, who is in attendance, to read out this question, and the response will be provided by Tracy Dark, who is remote, the Assistant Director of Economy and Place. If you'd like to read your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Is that on, is it?
Yes.
Dear committee members, today you will be scrutinising the impact of changes to the planning enforcement team and considering the report from the Assistant Director of Place, the reports on alleged improvements and the further improvements to be made over the next 6 months to planning enforcement. Not mentioned at all in the report is the issue of Shropshire Council not routinely checking planning conditions, which have been attached to planning consents to confirm they have been discharged before entry on the local land charges register. House buyers pay to access this information via their conveyance solicitors, and the council receives £500,000 income from this each year. The search results are certified as correct when this cannot be known to be true because they have not been checked. This is an alarming abrogation of responsibility by people who should know better. It is not the fault of applicants, as they do not certify the local land searches as correct. This council does that. Let's be clear, this is tantamount to fraud. Members will hopefully have read the additional information I supplied, which provides more details. Can I ask what this committee proposes to do about this? And will they look at 1, seeking a refund of all local land search fees paid since April 2009, and 2, recommending that all planning conditions are either checked by officers or certified by the planning applicant with a warning about false certification before entry on the local land charges register? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Tracy Dark, if you'd like to respond, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Law relating to the enforcement of planning conditions and the entries on the local land charges. As explained previously to you, conditions are discharged through a formal submission. This is a discharge of conditions application, which is then entered onto the local land charges system. Any conditions on a planning condition, decision that the planning service is notified of that have not been complied with, we will ensure they are investigated and appropriate action will be taken. If any individual has evidence that the entries on their local search that they have received are incorrect, then they are advised to contact the council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You have your response, Mr. Malloy. I'm happy to take a supplementary question should you wish to ask one.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I wasn't expecting that at all.
No.
I was expecting the sort of response I got, and to be honest, it's not satisfactory at all. These planning conditions, they're put there for a reason.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got to sort of like explain, you know, and they're put there for a reason, and you know, it's beholden upon the council to actually check that these conditions have been discharged before they put them on the charges register. Now the council's earning money from that.
So what is your question, please, Mr. Malloy?
Well, it's just to have my question answered properly, really.
You don't feel your question's been answered?
No, it's not been answered at all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to next member question time, and there are no questions. We'll move on to item 6, which is planning enforcement, and the report is going to be given to us by Tracy Dark. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, to say that planning enforcement is probably one of the most difficult parts of the planning service. It's often seen as the poor relation to the planning service, and it is often quite difficult to recruit staff that are interested in enforcement when you do have staff that are particularly passionate about enforcement, they're a team to hold on to. We are very fortunate in Shropshire Council to have that dedicated team, and it's a team that has been actually increased in size, so has been increased by 40% when there was a clear indication by the administration that they wanted to invest in enforcement. It is clearly a highly political hot potato, really, in terms of issues around enforcement and sites. And as part of that increase and support of the team, over the last 6 months, we have really focused on improvements to that service. So in the last 6 months, we have seen an absolute decrease in the number of cases on hand. They have nearly halved, and there have been significantly more formal notices being issued on planning enforcement. Of course, planning enforcement is a discretionary function of the council, and we have to be expedient and proportionate in how we deal with alleged breaches of planning control. This is often quite difficult for members and the public to understand, when actually they feel like they see some works on site and they want someone to march out there and stop it immediately. Of course, there are very few occasions when we can do that. In fact, it is only a very small handful, so listed buildings or works in conservation areas where buildings are being demolished are probably the key areas. Everything else, in the main, we can take action if it's unacceptable, but it is not an offence to carry out works without planning permission. So, for example, somebody can build a house without planning permission. The key issue is, if there had been a planning application submitted, would it have got planning permission? And if the answer is yes, then we encourage an application to regulate it. If the answer is no, serve an enforcement notice and take action against it. Planning enforcement is an area as well that is quite hard to often gain public confidence in the system. As I said, members of the public often see that if we've not rushed out there with an enforcement notice just because their neighbour has increased the height of their fence next to them by a few hundred millimetres, then that's completely unacceptable. And that's, as I said, where we have to sort of maybe look at the risk and harm element of any action. So, as I said, quite a challenging area really for enforcement. The progress we've made in terms of the team and the work over the last 6 months has been significant. And within the report, it identifies the number of cases that we've had, the number we've got on hand, the number of cases we have closed, and a sense around how many cases per area in the north and the south. So to give members and the public some idea of the level of work that they have. As you can see, the number of cases are significant that we've closed, and some of that over the last 12 months and certainly the last 6 months has been about housekeeping. There were quite a lot of cases in the system that just haven't been closed down, so already identified that there was no breach or there was no action to be taken, and we just needed to just sort of cleanse the system. The number of cases we currently have on hand in the north is about 107, and in the south we've got 169. So we're at 276, and that was at last thing on Friday evening. And we are also seeing that in terms of the balance of the north and the south, even though at the moment it looks just slightly askew, generally it feels it's about right in terms of the resource we've got in the north and the south. So that feels really positive. What's interesting is the number of formal notices that have been served. And whilst you may look at 19 and think, that doesn't sound too many, actually compared to many other authorities, it is significant. In fact, a lot of authorities may only issue 1 or 2 notices a year. And what is particularly interesting to highlight is the number of temporary stop notices and the stop notices as well. So there are very few councils that serve stop notices because of the high risk of compensation issues. So I think it is just to say to members, we are being really robust around how we're dealing with enforcement. Some of the difficult parts of enforcement that the team are now tackling, as they have now done a lot of the housekeeping work, is dealing with the difficult cases, the legacy cases that haven't been dealt with for some time. Some of those cases are difficult because they may have now, over time, become immune from enforcement, and that's really hard. But we have to close those down. If they are removed from enforcement now because historically they haven't been dealt with, then so be it. We have to do that. But we are certainly tackling some really, really knotty issues now. And of course, there are some difficult communications around that. So we are going into sites, clearing up sites, serving notices. May be difficult because, again, those cases have been trundling on for so long, but we are tackling those, and the team are doing really, really well with that. And of course, this work that we're doing on enforcement is part of the wider planning improvements we're doing to the service. So this, of course, enforcement is part of that wider dealing with planning applications and making sure that we're responding and dealing with some of the issues that flow from those decisions. So I would ask you as Overview Committee to support the work the enforcement team's doing, and obviously we will continue on that improvement journey over the next 6 months. It feels like the number of outstanding cases is getting pretty close to what would be a levelling position, probably around the 230 to 250 mark. So there's just a little bit more to go in terms of housekeeping, but it feels that, in terms of the scale of the team, they're doing really, really well. We've had new officers in, and they are absolutely, they've absolutely hit the ground running, have come from enforcement type backgrounds, so they know how the system works. It really feels like it's coming together on enforcement, and it is becoming a strong part of the planning team. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. If I can remind the recommendation. Do we know what's going on? Yeah, if I can just remind you of the recommendations, because we're asked that members advise on any further improvements that may be made to the service. So if you'll bear that in mind, having listened to that, the questions as well. First of all, we'll go to Councillor Paul Wynne.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, thank you for that, Tracy. I'm just wondering, that was very informative, thank you very much, and you put it across very well. I think all councillors on the county councillors have the same problem with enforcement. I'm just wondering whether this could be put out to parish councils. You explained it like that, it would save us a lot of headache, believe me, you put it far better than I can. So I'm just wondering whether we could do that, be it in a film form or written. I think it'd be very interesting, because it'll put them in a position and save us a lot of headache trying to explain how it works and how they perceive it to be not working. I'm just wondering if that's possible.
I think that's a really good idea, Paul. In fact, when we had the briefing last week, I did ask the question whether the briefing could be shared. Obviously, the briefing can't be shared, but I'm sure we could actually send something out to town and parish councils, even if it is just a report, because I think it does explain a lot. So I think that could be a recommendation, or we can just do it, whichever is easiest. Okay, thank you. We now have Nick Bardsley.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I wonder, first of all, what Tracy has told us is very welcome news indeed. What would be helpful, I think, to many of us would be to have some feel for how Shropshire Council compares in terms of enforcement activity, both with neighbouring local authorities and, perhaps more important, large rural local authorities who might be regarded as comparable to Shropshire. I'm not expecting Tracy to have the figures to hand, although they might well be available, but if those could be circulated, I think it would be very helpful, so that we can say, well, Shropshire's pretty much doing what comparable authorities do. And I absolutely appreciate, we are a very large, very rural area, and some breaches of planning control don't immediately come to light. I raised last week the question of planning conditions and their enforcement. So some comparisons with neighbouring and comparable authorities would be very helpful if Tracy could supply those.
If I could ask Tracy or Mark, have we done any benchmarking at all on this?
If I could come in first, and I don't know whether Mark wants to as well, but just to say that from working with lots of councils in the past, particularly around planning enforcement, we are in a really, really good position. I think, you know, as I said earlier, the investment that the council has made in resourcing the team is brilliant, because I think you will find in many, many councils it is a really small number of officers, if any, dealing with enforcement. So it is always, I'm afraid, the poor relations. So that investment is key. In terms of on top of the cases, the number of cases that the officer is absolutely at the average. So, you know, it's a manageable caseload. As I said, there are some knotty issues to deal with still, but we will break the back of those very shortly. So it feels we're in a really, really strong position. We can, of course, do some benchmarking, but I think you'll find we're in the top group, which is a positive thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Julian Dean.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. The report focuses on whether development is allowed, but nearly all the issues I've had around planning enforcement has been over conditions of planning as a process. So complaints about whether roads are being looked after, whether vehicle access is being appropriately, whether the rules around that are being appropriately followed, parking of traders' vehicles, all that sort of thing. And there's nothing in the report around those concerns, and to be honest, those are all the concerns that I've had on this issue. So where are we with that? Because I think that's, you know, in my experience, is a much bigger concern.
Would you like to respond, Tracy?
Yes. I mean, when we talk about planning enforcement, that includes conditions as well. So breach of conditions are one of the formal notices that we can deal with if conditions are not complied with. So we are, you know, of course, enforcement, you know, being brutally honest, is a reactive service. It's a reactive service everywhere. There are no councils that can have officers, because we need a whole army of them to be able to follow up every condition that's put on a planning permit. So it's reactive in terms of if conditions are not complied with, we should then respond. As I've said, it's work in progress. The team has done significant amount of improvement. There is some to go yet, so there will still be cases, I'm sure you could cite back at me, that we've not actually dealt with yet, but we should be out there and responding quickly now. So if we do have a site that's started on site and there's a construction management plan that says that the roads need to be clear with mud, then it is hoped that if we have a complaint through the portal to say that that's the case, then officers will be out pretty quickly. So I'd like to think that we are starting to really pick up on some of the conditions on decisions, but we respond to those when we have complaints. We don't, I'm afraid, drive around looking for enforcement problems, I think it's fair to say. I hope that's answered your question.
Julie wants to ask another question.
I absolutely accept that it's reactive, and that's quite right. I wouldn't expect you to go around to, you know, if nobody's complained and nobody's raised any issues. I think, but having, you know, being told that officers go out is not the same as being told what actually happens. I wonder if it'd be possible to get perhaps a case study on something like, you know, the Weir Hill development or the Parish or one of, you know, one of the larger developments where I'm sure there would have been plenty of residents saying, you know, there's trucks going up and down my road at hours when they're not supposed to be, or the roads haven't been cleared, or, you know, vehicle wing mirrors are getting clipped by developers, you know, just to get a case study really to understand both how we react, but also perhaps how the developers react to us, so that we have an understanding of which developers are behaving well and which aren't, and whether there's anything else we should be doing, and so that we can go back to our communities and say, actually, these are the, you know, these are the ways, these are the best ways in which to push for a better service around these issues.
A biggie is mud on the road. Going on. Tracy, is there any way of reporting back to members, you know, when they have concerns? For instance, if Julian came and said, I'm worried these conditions aren't being followed, is there any way of even adding them maybe as an addendum to the planning committee papers?
In terms of reporting enforcement, it is a function that's delegated to officers. So in the Constitution, it doesn't allow it just to be lifted up to planning committee. But I think the point around communications is certainly something that we as the team have discussed. I think the case study idea is really good. We want to do more comms, and that is about getting stuff out into the media. So some good news stories. We did have, I did do some slides for the member development session that we had last Thursday that Councillor Barrow chaired, and within those slides, you know, it's be careful what you wish for. There was about 24 slides, but in some of those it showed case studies, so it showed the before and after. So particularly around 215 notices, so that's like tidying up site notices, you know, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looked like after. So I think some powerful visuals like that are good. As we said earlier, happy to be able to share those slides, and I think out to the parish councils as well. That'd be really good. And then maybe, as you said, pick up some real case studies, perhaps on one or two larger development sites, if that would help.
Can I just add my apologies for missing that session last week?
It was excellent, actually, and there were quite a lot of people attending, because obviously there is a lot of interest from members. Are you picking up on the things that people want,
Yes,
like contacting parish councils
Yes,
and case studies? I think that's a really good idea. Thank you. David Bassner.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for this report. It's very useful. I'd just like to back up what Councillor Dean was saying. Actually, my problems I've had have been to do with conditions. And I think the idea of a case study is a good one. But also, I think whether in the stats we've been given in 7.5, whether they could be broken down in terms of what complaints are to do with conditions and what are, you know, planning applications not being followed, permissions not being followed properly. That would be useful as well. And it comes also, I mean, it's around the issue. I think the important issue here is to do with communication. You of course can't police every condition, every breach. But you can actually have communications which actually emphasise the importance and the fact that you will actually take up the issues which are raised by residents. So I mean, I think there's a feeling we all get that people think that nothing is done and nothing will ever be done. And the more cases you can actually publicise, I think the better that understanding will be, and also maybe make developers and people with with planning permission think twice about that make breaches. Secondly, I'd just like to go on to on 7.5 stats, and I think it'd be useful to have information about how many cases are a bit long-standing cases. You've got cases here about current cases on hand, but it'd be useful to have an idea of how many of those are new cases and how many cases have been outstanding for a long period of time. I think it'd be useful to know that, so we can get an idea of how you're dealing with the backlog. There's also, if you look at paragraph 7.6, you talk about looking at cases since March 2021, and I believe 7.5 you're saying over the last 12 months. I think it's sensible to have stats which refer to one period, rather than stats which can cover more than one period. But yeah, I just think it's very, very useful. But I just think, as I say, I think the most important thing probably at the end of the day is to get publicity out there about the effect, and the fact that we are taking action. We take breaches very seriously.
I think a recommendation from the committee perhaps could be, I don't know whether it needs to be set in stone or whether we can actually ask that there regularly are comms messages going out saying what we're doing and how we're enforcing it. Would that be possible, or is it better to actually make it a recommendation, as you say, Daniel?
Oh, you could make this recommendation.
I think we'll do that. I'll come back to you at the end for all the things we've said, if that's okay. Right, thank you very much. Thank you, David. Very good points there. Steve Davenport.
Okay. Yes, I think it's great news, really. This is something that's going on for time and memorial. But I'd like to know how many enforcement cases have ended up in court, fines imposed, or buildings taken down, not just retrospective planning granted. Also, just as a separate, we used to have it on the planning committee. I think full sheet that would indicate all the planning enforcement in that particular area, north, south or central at that time, which seems to have gone by the wayside. So at one point we were able to follow all enforcement cases. I don't think that's the case anymore, and it was very useful.
Would you like to answer that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can do this, really. You know, if it's an information report to committee, perhaps it can be done on a sort of quarterly or 6-monthly basis, and we can provide information. Of course, some of that information has to be limited because there is, you know, confidentiality issues with it. You know, a lot of enforcement matters are sensitive at the early stage. Of course, further down the line, of course, they're not, you know, they are more in the public domain. So there's no reason why we couldn't start to put together that regular performance update for committee just as information, and then that can be shared widely with members. So I think as part of that improvement plan that we're doing, we can add it to that and look at the ways of taking that forward if members agree.
I would suggest members that we do ask for that on a quarterly basis to the planning committee, exempt because obviously there is stuff in there that can't be shared with the public. Would everybody be happy to add that to the recommendation? We'll just come to them all at the end, and then we'll either vote them through wholly or partly, if that's all right. If we could do that, we'll do that at the end, Tracy, and then you'll know what we are requesting. Very good comment there. Thank you, Steve. Pam Mosley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Just as a preamble, I'd like to say I'm pleased to see that the enforcement work has been separated from the planning officer's work. It always used to be separate. In authorities I've worked in, it was very much an absolutely separate job. Obviously, there was communication between the two. And the enforcement officers very often were not planners by profession. They came from all backgrounds and quite often policemen for the hard jobs. On regard to reporting, I noticed as a town council in Shrewsbury, we now get notifications through the town council any enforcement action on a confidential basis in our area, but we don't seem to get results. Now, obviously some of these can take months, if not years, to resolve. I think that would be a good idea if the towns and parishes, be notified of the action to get some
I think absolutely. The same happens with my parish council. They get enforcement notices and then we never hear anything about it again. So I think that's another one to add on, please, Dan. This is going to be very long. No.
And one other point, it's a question really of Tracy. We talked about historic cases and ones that are out of time and they're now immune from action. When does the clock start ticking? Is it on receipt of complaint? Is it on first contact? At what point are the judges to be out of time? And then if they do lapse into not being able to progress, if someone else made a further separate complaint about the same thing, would the clock start again on that?
So the immunity issue is really, for example, if there has been works carried out. So and I'll give you an extreme example. Someone's built a house in a haystack. There was a national case around that, wasn't there? If that's been there for more than 4 years and there's been no complaints about it, then it becomes immune. There is a bit in enforcement legislation around if you pervert the course of justice, so actually you're trying to circumvent a situation, which that one obviously was a case of. But it's just to say that if it's about the time period, so you would have to provide evidence that you were within the 4 years. And that's not just about when the complaint was received, it's about the evidence. You've obviously got somebody who has tried to work around the system and they will say, well, we built it more than 4 years ago. And here's the evidence that we've got that it was built more than 4 years ago. So it's a case to be argued. It's about the evidence that's key to the answer.
Okay, thank you. Can I pick up on something that Councillor Bowes said about enforcement officers and planning? I'm going to bring Tim Rogers in if he hasn't gone to sleep. Are you there, Tim? Are you there,
I am
Tim?
here, yes. Yes, I'm here, yes.
A question for you, because I always thought that actually planning officers were the enforcement officers many years ago, if I remember, with Oswestry Borough Council. I don't think they have always been separate roles, have they?
Before we went unitary, most of the district authorities did have dedicated enforcement officers.
Oh,
We did actually have dedicated enforcement officers at Oswestry for a while, although I think the planning officers there certainly did enforcement as part of their role, but most of the district authorities had dedicated enforcement officers. And when we first went unitary, I think there were probably about 8 enforcement officers dedicated that came together as part of that team, and then over the years those numbers dwindled, and we were at a point where we had only 1 or 2 dedicated enforcement officers, and that's when we took the decision to make it the responsibility of planning officers as well. But I think we would have to hold our hands up and say that probably didn't work as well as we anticipated or would have liked, and hence the move back to having a dedicated team.
right, yeah, I can see it would be a very controversial role and one that lots of people haven't got an appetite for. Thank you for that, Tim. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. My question has already been asked, actually, which is parish and town councils are informed that there is a breach, but we're never informed of how it's resolved. And I really do think their support and that is something that really does irritate me. Can I just ask one other question? Is there any discretion if somebody has permission to build a 6-foot fence and they build a 7-foot fence? Who decides? I mean, is it automatically got to be put back to 6 foot, or is there any discretion? Do the officers actually decide the appropriate course of action with the applicants?
I think I know the answer to this one, but I'm not going to tap clocks. Casey.
So it's about whether it's proportionate and expedient to take action. So the example you've given, in some cases, even though the fence has been built at 7 foot high, well, I mean, you're talking of 100 millimetres above, so it's actually 2 metres. So if it's 7 foot, which is 2.1 metres, then we would have to consider whether it was proportionate to take action against that. And in most cases, it probably isn't. But, you know, it's not, you know, the requirements in terms of what's permitted development are there for a reason. So if someone's built the height of the fence 2.5 metres, for example, it might become a little bit more oppressive on the neighbour, and then we would consider whether to take action or not. So it's not, as I said earlier, it's not the case that there has been a breach, therefore we serve an enforcement notice. We have to assess what the harm is. All the permitted development rights do is say this needs planning permission. It doesn't say if it's over this, you take enforcement action. You have to then consider, you know, there has to be a planning judgment around whether there has been any harm by the breach of planning control.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask, so Councillor Wynn's suggestion about a sort of a document to help inform parish councils, I think is a really good idea. And a comment I would make is that people seem to think that the council enforcement team is a police and is a reactive service. So I think making the point that it's you know, it's not a proactive, you know, it's a reactive service. I think, you know, it would be really useful to help, you know, to make that point a little bit louder if we are going to have a briefing document for parish councils, because, you know, in recent cases that I've had, you know, that has been an issue. Why hasn't the council seen this? And, you know, it's possibly because it reacts to people as opposed to going out and actively finding out what's going on. And then I just wondered, what is the sort of, what is considered an adequate time frame for officers to respond to people who have comments about potential breaches of planning, and do we track that as a council in terms of, you know, how we do respond? Thank you.
Thank you. Tracy.
So again, it comes back to you know, the seriousness of the harm. So if we were to, for example, say, well, you know, the fence is 2.1 metres and we have to consider that and investigate that, then, you know, we would start looking at, you know, which are the sort of less important ones to take action against. That might be in that group, where we have, for example, we've heard that all of a sudden we've got aggregate lorries arriving on a site, start laying down a road to a gypsy and traveller encampment, then we might be out pretty quick to that site. So I think that's just to demonstrate, you know, we have to have things that are high risk and proportionate, you know, we have to be proportionate in terms of the action we take and how we respond. I think just in terms of the point about notifying town and parish councils, yes, we are definitely looking at that in terms of how we can communicate the messages around formal action to those. We do notify them and will continue to notify them of enforcement notices. Of course, what we need to understand as well and be clear on is that if we serve an enforcement notice on a some planning issue, then that can deal with the issue there and then. And that planning enforcement notice stays as a charge on the property. So if it's about a use, for example, it might stop the use, you know, the premises being used as a HIMO, for example. When that's happened, that enforcement notice stays. And if it actually starts to become used as a HIMO again in the future, we can again take action or prosecute on the back of that. So there is a point about, yes, we can notify parish and town councils better, and we recognise that that's an improvement to the service that we need to be making. It's just to say that, you know, notices, you know, they're a charge on the property and they stay with the property forever.
Thank you. Happy with that, Claire? Thank you. Paul, when you want to come back?
Thank you, Chair. Good idea, Dan. Thanks very much for that. Other thing is, Tracy, I just a thought, can the local members be informed of anything on their patch? Because we're at the cold front here. We go to parish meetings, town meetings, we are there, they're asking us the questions. And if we were informed, and if the enforcement officer had our name next to the enforcement case, they could keep us up to date with every enforcement case as a local member. This is the information we need to go back to our parishes and town councils.
Well, we are informed. I don't know whether you get the emails, but I think most members do get enforcement notices, but we don't get any follow-up. All we get is the enforcement. So what you actually want, what you're acting for.
The follow-up information all the times it's going through, our names will be by it, make sure our names are by it, let us know what's going on so we can report back to the council.
I do think that's a very important point, because you feel like an enforcement notice is being served and then nothing happens. It's like, yeah. So if we could be kept up to date, there must be an easy way of doing that.
Report, put your name against it, right? I'll inform council when what's going on in his patch.
Do you think there's some way of doing that, Tracy?
Chair, yes. I think we just need to be cognizant about what we're expecting the team to do as well, though. You know, things are fast moving. You know, we have lots of complaints every week. Some of them are very low level. They're not even breaches of control, and they are dealt with like, you know, they're triage and first point of contact, and a lot of those are just closed. So, you know, we do have sort of ranging from a dozen to maybe 20 complaints a week. So a lot of them, as I say, are taken out at first point of contact. But certainly we rely on parish and town councils and information from them to be able to help us to gather evidence around some of the breaches. It does take a bit of time, so we like to think we are notifying the right people, but I think more can always be done. So we'll take that away and look at more ways we can inform parish and town councils at the different stages.
I'd like to know what the breakdown is actually of town and parish councils reporting things and members of the public, because I would think members of the public report far more than the town and parish councils. Well, I know in my area, I don't know about anybody else's area, but I don't know how you pick up on that and how you find that balance. Julian.
Thank you. Actually, it occurred when, I can't remember what the question was, but something around the reactive, proactive issue. So I understand that the whole thing is triggered by complaints, but once an enforcement notice has been issued, what's the follow-up in terms of ensuring that enforcement notice itself is being complied with? Do we have to wait for yet another complaint? Or is it then with the enforcement team to make sure that their own enforcement notice is actually complied with?
Tracy.
So the example I gave earlier about HIMO, housing multiple occupation, is probably quite a good one, really. So we can, you know, we're informed that there's a HIMO, we take action, we serve an enforcement notice, the breach stops, the enforcement notice stays on the property as the local land charge, and then 3 years later, there's another breach, it starts being used again. We would rely on neighbours and residents to flag it up. I mean, there is a point around, and I know this might be slightly controversial, but if nobody complains, is there a concern? Is there any harm? So, you know, I think that has to be the starting position for most enforcement services. But, you know, I think if we get a notification later again, it is reliant on residents to tell us that there are issues again, and we will then go out and deal with the case. I think Tim wants to come in and add to that.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, if I could just add to that. In terms of when we got to the point of serving a formal notice, then of course at that point you've already determined that the breach that's occurring is a serious breach and warrants the notice. And it is incumbent on us as officers to then follow up to check that those notices have been complied with, because that is the point. If an enforcement notice gives a time period for compliance with the requirements of the notice, and if the landowner doesn't meet those requirements, that's the point at which they can be prosecuted, because they've not complied with the requirements of the notice. So yes, the answer to the question is, when at the point we've reached the decision to issue a formal notice, then we will at that point clearly follow up that to make sure that the notice is complied with.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Can I ask a couple of questions? I don't mind who answers, whether it's Tim or whether it's Tracy. I think Mark's getting away very likely today. The first questions are: the report states that the service has recently recruited 2 additional officers. Do those officers solely work within the planning enforcement team, and what will be the focus of those officers once the backlog of cases has been reduced? But I'm asking that question, but I am aware that you do have some agency staff, don't you? So I assume they will disappear when their contract is up. I'll let you answer that, and I'll come back with another question. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So thank you, Chair. So we don't have any agency people in our planning enforcement service anymore. We did have one agency person whilst we recruited Dave Sambrook and Mick Laidlaw. They're now in post, and they've been in post for about 2 to 3 months now. So we have no agency people in the enforcement team. We have a fully resourced team, and as I said earlier, we are very, very lucky to have that. They are from enforcement backgrounds, so as I said, they hit the ground running. So we did have a backlog of work, but of course we had a team that couldn't handle the number of cases that they had on hand, and some of those larger cases were just not being dealt with because they just did not have the time to get to them and deal with them, because, you know, certainly Emma Green and Julian Beeston were, you know, trying to get enforcement notices out, and they take a long time. It's significant work to gather all the evidence, and they were completely drowning. So I think this has really given them the capacity to deal with some of the really hard enforcement cases, and for us to be better as a service. And that's what we're hoping for as we go forward. It isn't just solely about the numbers, it's about a quality service that we want to provide in Shropshire Council.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And one more question: has the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions affected the rate at which you receive enforcement complaints? And how do you forecast demand to change in the next couple of years? And what are your plans to respond to that change?
So COVID did seem to impact on the number of complaints. You know, people are at home and they're looking out their window, you know, and seeing people, their neighbours doing things, and it's dead easy then just to drop an email into the portal. So we did, excuse me, we did see an upsurge of complaints. That has settled down a bit now, and we are going into the winter period, so it is of course a bit seasonal really as well. You know, lots of people are out in the spring doing work to their property and the neighbours are complaining. So COVID, yes, COVID did impact on it. Yes, we are seeing a reduction in that now, and you know, I think in terms of going forward, as I said, we've got plans for the service. I think it's been really, really helpful actually to get some feedback today, and we've got some additional things we can now add to our improvement plan for the wider service.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions or members? Yes, that's one.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And just an obvious point, I think over the last couple of years, when I absolutely understand that enforcement didn't have enough people on the ground, people perhaps stopped complaining because they felt that it was just a complete waste of time complaining because nothing happened. So I mean, it's hugely encouraging to see this drop in the number of cases. And I think the publicity that we're now going to give, you may actually get more complaints than you had before, because people now feel it's worth complaining. So I think that's a welcome development, but I suspect that you may find that there are, you know, once parish councils and local residents think, well, it's worth complaining because something's going to be happening, then that may well lead to additional complaints. Thank you.
That's a happy note to finish on. Right, if we can just go back to recommendations from the committee, if we can, you can just say them all, and then if everybody's happy with them, we will just vote them all through together. If that's all right.
Well, I've got a number here that you might want to have a little bit more discussions, make them a little bit more specific, because they are quite general at the moment.
Could you put your mic on, please?
Oh, pardon me.
Thank you.
There you go. There was one recommendation around working more closely with town and parish councils, but I think there was a recommendation around the communication, and also one around the information we send to them. So I think that just needs a bit more clarification on actually what recommendations you want to make around the liaison with town and parish councils. There was a recommendation around developing some case studies to better inform elected members, and there was a recommendation around developing a more proactive communication strategy. I think that related both to town and parish councils and members of the public. And you've also requested that officers provide a quarterly update on enforcement activities of the committee going forward.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Julian.
Yeah, just to add some detail then, I think it was Councillor Basman made the point about reporting on cases by type, so that we understand where it is, you know, a development has gone up without permission, and where it is conditions not being applied to. And just in terms of that conditions not being applied to, I would be interested, I'm not trying to put a load of work on with this, that the report perhaps has a bit of a commentary on how, you know, on how developers are behaving, if you like. You know, it could just be literally a paragraph to say in the last quarter we've seen a notable increase in people complaining about contractors' trucks or something, just so we get a bit of a feel for whether the developers are behaving or not.
I am concerned because I know our officers are really busy, particularly within planning and enforcement, and it's a resource there. That's what I would ask first of all, and if the resource isn't there, can we get the resource to ensure that the information that we want will be forthcoming? Mark, I'll aim that one at you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think there's a wider context here, which we haven't touched on, which is actually Tracy's driving a whole kind of service excellence programme across planning, and we touched on it in enforcement today. How about, and my suggestion would be perhaps early in the new year sometime, we come back on a wider report. Planning is one of the most highly visible services we've got, and its impacts are really quite profound as well. But there is a lot of work going on across the service, not just enforcement. To be fair to Tracy, she's driving a lot of things, and there is a lot of change afoot, Chair. So more than happy to report on that wider programme to members as well.
Yes, but we still need to put forward recommendations, I think. First of all, if we go to we want training for town and parish councils on enforcement. We need to communicate to them exactly what is happening, similar to the briefing that members had. I don't know whether we can do that via video, whether that can be, and we can send it to all the town and parish councils, and then they can share it out. I think that would be good as a start. Yeah. Also, they need to know, besides the training, they need to know when enforcement notices, which they already do, are served, what then happens and when those enforcement notices are closed. Yeah.
Chair.
Yes. Paul?
May I suggest?
I've got a second, please. Paul?
May I suggest that if the parish council reports something, or the local member does, on those subjects alone, just keep them informed. A lot of people put complaints in, but if the parish council does, I think it carries more weight and they ought to be informed. That might make it easier.
I think maybe on a quarterly basis. I think that wouldn't be too much, I don't think, would it? I'm looking to officers, I'm not making decisions for officers. It's up to us what to put forward in recommendation. But I'm also aware that we need to have that manpower there. And I think we want this to happen ASAP, really, don't we?
Do you want a proposal putting forward?
Yes.
Well, I'll propose.
Yes, Daniel.
I suggest actually, I think there's probably a scope for a discussion here. I suspect that discussion might happen outside of a formal committee meeting. So I think it might be an idea actually for the committee to take a little bit of time just to sort of talk through the pros and cons of these recommendations as suggested, and then to share them formally with officers and then to publish them in your next meeting minutes. I think that will provide that's a good balance to give you the sort of time to discuss them and the accountability to publish them.
Are you suggesting maybe a virtual meeting between members and try and nail down what exactly it is we want to come forward?
Well, I'm suggesting if we had time actually that whilst everyone's here, that we conclude the meeting where we conclude the meeting and then just spend 10, 15 minutes just talking through.
Is everybody happy to do that at the end of the meeting? Members of the committee? Oh, please say yes, everybody. There's two people very enthusiastic.
At least we'll get things moving on quickly, won't it?
Yes, it will. Yes, we'll do that then, Daniel. Okay, and then we'll come back to officers who I know have got a magic wand and will sort it all out for us. Thank you. Okay, and we obviously noted the report, so we can now move on to item 7. If you'd like to explain, Daniel, for us why we deferred it.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, very sorry for the recommendation that we defer this item. I know this is a topic that a lot of you are very keen to get under the skin of. When we agreed this piece of work, you set quite a body of work for us to do to prepare for this in terms of desktop research. So myself and Democratic Services officers have been pulling together that work for you. The first part of that was a look at other local authorities and how they structure themselves, and that work's finished and we've written that up. The second piece of research was to send a questionnaire around to 10 parish councils and to elected members to gather their thoughts and to contribute towards your deliberations. Ordinarily, when we do a piece of work like this, we get a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen responses. This time we had quite a few responses asking for an extension to that deadline, but also as well we got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of responses. I think it was close to about 100. So simply we've just not had enough time to collate those. It's only myself at the moment who's doing this work. We've not had time to collate it and to publish that and to share it with officers so they can meaningfully contribute to it as well. Read that report for you. So the simple fact is we're just not ready yet. So we're asking that you defer this item to November to give us a bit more time to prepare for you.
And when we get to the work programme at the end, I don't think we even need to take a vote on it actually, because I'm sure everybody wants it to come to the next meeting and to be resolved and recommendations go forward at the soonest possible moment. So shall I take that as a given that that's going to go on to the next work, the next stage? Steve, you want to come in there?
I just want to I'd be interested to do this as well, because in my 10 years as scrutiny chair, I looked at this 3 times, visited Crewe, Cheshire, Herefordshire, Worcester councils, so I've got a lot of input I can go from here and why we ended up where we did.
Okay.
A lot of history.
So hopefully you'll be on the next meeting and you can give your insight. Okay, thank you very much. In that case, we will now move on to the work programme. Right, Daniel, do you want to take it away?
Okay, thank you, Chair. At the moment, you have quite a busy November now. You have several items on there, so I think the committee may need to ask itself how it divvies this work up going forward. At the moment, there are 4 items for your November meeting. The topic which is discussed around planning committee structures, an update on work to develop winter maintenance following your recommendations in March this year. A requested report on maintenance regimes for clearing footpaths and cycle paths, and your periodic review of the development of the local transport plan LTP4. There's no meeting in December, then in January. Again, you have 3 items lined up for this. One around communicating highways works and repairs, which we've just touched on at this meeting. You've requested a further update on your task and finish group around signs, barriers and banners. And by then as well, we've completed the working group report into roadworks diversions. Actually, I can see finally on there as well, there's a request for a report on the Developing the Highways Capital Programme in light of the manifesto commitments following the local elections in May. So there's a lot on there at the moment. That strikes me as rather too much for 2 meetings. So the committee might want to ask itself how it separates this work going forward. Does it want to host an extra meeting? Does it want to defer some of these items until later in the year? That's up to you.
Okay. If I ask first of all, if does anybody want to defer anything that is on there? Yes, Nick.
I suspect it's just a typo, but briefing on Shrewsbury Big Town Plan, is it really intended to wait until December 2022?
Yeah, that is indeed a typo. The briefing session happens on 6th of December 2021 at 10:15. You should have all had an invite in your diaries now. I can see the replies pinging back, so I know you have.
Well spotted. Well spotted, Nick. I'm assuming if nobody says they don't want to defer it, would everybody be happy to have an extra meeting? Yeah? Can we have hands just so I can double check? Excellent. Okay, so there you go then. We're going to have an extra meeting. I do wonder whether, do you think the planning might be one to hold on its own, because there is an awful lot of interest in that one.
I think
Do you think the planning one, because that is something quite important to everyone, would you like that as a meeting on its own? Or do you think?
Committee structures.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think it does need it.
Okay, that's great. Okay. And do you happy with that, Daniel?
Chair, can I just raise one issue, just on
Yes, you can.
on WSP, we've got WSP down, I think, to discuss. WSP contracting arrangement from speaking to February 2021. I'm not sure what we are with WSP contract, but I'd hope that we'd be able to discuss that before it was actually agreed. I mean, I'm worried that by the time we get around to it, it'll be agreed.
Yeah, Mark, when is it being agreed? Yeah.
Chair, just to come in, so there is an extension underway at the moment whilst we redraft it, so it'll just be wider than highways as well. It'll cover a range of other consultancy services. So the full intention would be before that goes anywhere near the public domain, we will bring it to committee. So let me get you an update on that timetable, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Good point there. Thank you. Okay. So is everybody happy with the programme now? And could everybody vote on if they're happy with it, please? Everybody happy? Yeah? Yeah. Unanimous. Thank you very much. So the date and time of the next meeting, unless we shove one in before, is November the 11th. Are you looking at dates now, are you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. And I'm going to say, Andy, because you're online, if you want to stay with us at the end of the meeting, when we look at what recommendations we want to put forward, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so on that note, I'll close the meeting. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. If members will just stay behind for 1/4 of an hour, that'd be great. Or 10 minutes. Tell us when we're offline, please, Ashley.